I actually encountered Hal, like we do often today, on the internet. That sounds kind of strange, but I mean, I saw him in a video. I believe it was the Big Ideas Fest. And he has a very interesting profile and personal story, and I'll leave that to Hal to tell. But as it says here, he is the Senior Policy Advisor to the Undersecretary of Education, Martha Cantor. But perhaps more importantly is the fact that he has been a long-time proponent of open education. And I want to also promote, this is one of his publications, Free to Learn. There is a saying in open education movement, free, not as in free beer, but as in free speech. So it does cost money to produce materials, but we want them to be open in terms of open scholarship and to give our ideas away. So this is an excellent primer that he's written on the movement. It details all the different kinds of the different facets of open education, what it means. So if there's one takeaway that you want to be sure that you have carrying back to your institutions, it's Free to Learn by Hal. So basically I asked Hal to give us a little bit of an idea of what the Department of Education thinks about open education and how that kind of fits into where things are going today. So he has promised to say a couple of things about that. And also, I'm sure we have questions later on after his talk to ask him about where the Department of DOE stands on a host of issues, particularly on international education and foreign languages, as well as open education. So, Hal, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carl. Thanks very much, and I guess, pardon me, I brought my drink up here because I need to do more listening and less talking. I'm losing my voice, and I know our friends needed to do a mic check, and everything is good. So good morning, and thank you all for being here. I'm really delighted to be here, and mostly to salute your leadership and to encourage you and tell you that as important as you think your work is, and we all like to think that what we do is important, and that we're important as individuals, that many of us in the open educational resources movement and indeed in the Obama administration regard your work as essential, and certainly important enough for me to take some time to be with you this morning. I apologize if I'm a little disjointed. I was preparing my remarks. Carl was talking about how far everybody came to be here, and I want to put in a nomination for myself, at least over the last 72 hours, as having come the furthest, because just a little under 48 hours ago I was in Indonesia at the World Conference on Open and Distance Learning, which brought together 400 or 500 scholars from around the world who are increasingly collaborating and using open educational resources to serve the overwhelming need for high-quality education that is unmet by traditional methods. And although I have to say I'm a little disappointed, because when I was in Indonesia and the authorities there took me after the formal meeting from place to place to meet different dignitaries, they squired me around in a formal motorcade with a police officer at front and police motorcycles on the side and behind, with the whole entourage followed by an ambulance for the entire day. And when I asked them, you know, why the ambulance, they said, well, you know, you're an American government official. If anything bad were to happen, we wouldn't want you to wait. So, so it was a little disconcerting. It's the first time I'd ever been trailed by an ambulance. But I kind of got used to it. And so when I got here to Austin last night, I was looking for my ambulance, Carl, and hopefully we won't see one today. I have the high honor, and I'll explain to you why. It's great. I see so many new faces in the room. I can tell a story that Carl has heard, but I suspect many of you have not. I know Rich is not in the room. He's heard the story now probably 15 times, so that's probably why he'll join us when he knows it's over. But I have the high honor of giving you greetings from the President of the United States, Barack Obama, the Vice President, Joe Biden, the Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, and the Undersecretary of Education, Martha Cantor, who I know takes a lot of real personal interest in your work and in this work. And in a few moments, you'll understand why it is such an extraordinary development that I would be standing in front of you speaking on behalf of the President of the United States. It's gobsmackingly strange in some respects. But to do that, I need to back up a little bit and tell you a little bit about myself, as Carl indicated I would. And in doing it, I tell this story not because it's a particularly unique story. In fact, it's probably in one dimension or another one of the most common stories experienced around the planet, but also because it again reinforces the importance of your work in developing and continuously improving open educational resources, particularly in the field of language acquisition. My sister and I grew up in a single-parent family in California where our father was absent from the time we were young kids, and my mother was ill and frequently unable to work. And so we were raised on food stamps and welfare. And by the time we got to high school, my sister and I, it was either stay in school and watch our house get lost, a situation quite familiar to a lot of people today, but one that back in the 1970s left us with a good deal of shame, or drop out of school, stop going to school, high school, and work so that we could help her meet the monthly mortgage payment. Believe it or not, the mortgage payment on a house in Palo Alto, California, where we were raised at that time, was $287.50 a month. It's a number I'll never forget, because by the end of every month we had to raise that much money along with whatever public assistance we got to keep the foreclosure vultures away. And so my sister and I both dropped out to work in the same, or left school rather, I should say, to work in the same pizza parlor, where I was making $1.50 an hour under the table every night. The owner of the pizza parlor would go to the cash register right before I left at midnight or 1 a.m. or something like that, and he'd peel off dollar bills and hand me my stack of 10 or 12 or 11 or 14 or whatever I had coming that night. And I would take them home and put them on a stack on the counter, and the goal was to have 287 of them by the end of every month. And one day, while I was at work, and I had stopped going to high school, I guess this was, I think, 10th grade, for quite some time, many, many months anyway. And I picked up the newspaper on a work break, and there was a story in the newspaper about dropouts. And I thought it was a really pejorative story. It was full of all sorts of sort of accusatory observations about why students dropped out. And, you know, they're probably all taking drugs, and nobody ever really explained to them how important school is. They don't understand that either. What's wrong with these kids? And I remember just being furious about it. And that night, I went home, and on a piece of binder paper with a pencil, I wrote a letter to the editor, and in which I excoriated him and the newspaper for writing such an obviously biased, indeed insulting article and allowing it to be published. And I suggested to him at the time that he was contributing to the very problem that he was trying to illuminate by using these pejorative understandings of the issue, and also the very word dropout itself, to which I objected. I explained to him that my younger sister and I hadn't dropped out of anything. In fact, we felt like we had been pushed out, and that nobody cared, nobody came to look for us, beyond sending some postcards to our house that my mother never saw or opened, because she would go months at a time without even looking at the mail. The system was not responding in any way, and the very first thing that the news media could do would be to start describing this problem in ways that those of us who were experiencing it would recognize, so that there would be at least some chance that effective public policies and public interventions could be put into place that would give folks like my sister and myself an opportunity to get back in school. And I signed the letter in pencil and mailed it off. And a few days later, the editor of that newspaper caught up with me, found me in the pizza parlor, and told me he had liked my letter so much that could he print it edit it a bit and print it as a guest editorial with a byline and pay me $50. And so a career as a writer was born. And I went on. It took me about 8 years. I finally graduated high school with the help of the public attention created by that episode. But was working, 20, 30, 40 hours a week for the entire time while going back to school. And I eventually went to Foothill Community College, where I worked full-time. And gradually over time, I started doing more and more writing. I would write at night. Back then, I'm old enough now to remember when word processors came out. I moved from the pencil on binder paper to an IBM Selectric typewriter that I had bought for, I think, $35. And then eventually, I started working after the drugstore. I went to work at a sponsored project at the Veterans Administration, where they actually had one of the world's first word processors. And I remember this device was a marvel to anybody who saw it. It had not the capability you'd find on my BlackBerry, and I remember Mr. Wang and his company, and the $40,000 system that I was one of the first people at Stanford to, because I was then a manuscript editor, working part-time while going to school, a manuscript editor, and I learned how to use the word processing. And so I would do my writing in the evening after work and whatnot, and one thing led to another. And by the time, 8 or 10 years later, that I had a associate's degree and an undergraduate degree from the State University, San Jose State University, I was already working for different national and international news organizations. And over time wrote, I think it's close to 650 published articles in a variety of different publications in the United States and overseas, focusing mostly on technology and public policy and science and education and the links between all of them. And so I knew from my own personal experiences, it was not for me a theoretical issue, that there was an enormous gap in our country, and one that is even more yawning around the world, between the capacities and desires with regard to education and the system's ability to match resources to those needs and opportunities. This was not a theoretical issue that, gee, if we created more schools, would there be enough qualified students who would take advantage of those opportunities? If we figured out how to provide essential support for students so that they could have high quality opportunities, would we be wasting our time? And I knew that it was just the opposite, that there was an enormous need, an unmet need that our systems, that our formal systems were not responding to. So to fast forward the story a bit, I had some success in media production circles and ended up working for publications and organizations like CNBC and Barron's and the Wall Street Journal's publications, Harvard Business School publications, and others. And 25 years later, almost a little over 25 years later, there was a vacancy on the Board of Trustees for the Foothill De Anza Community College District, the same community college district I had started attending when I was in my teenage years. And they had never had, it's an elective position in California, an elective governance position. The community college district supervises 2 community colleges with about 45,000 students between the 2 of them, located right in the heart of Silicon Valley. And there had never been a graduate of Foothill College to ever serve on the governing board of trustees. Typically a different profile, as you probably know, finds themselves as members of boards of trustees at colleges and universities than is found resident in the student body in most cases. And I was approached. One of the odd circumstances of life is that because I had spent so much time taking 1 class or 2 classes at a time, going to night school, all the rest, at this community college 25 years earlier, and at the time kind of really feeling a bit cheated by it, to be honest, because I remember a lot of kids that I went through junior high school with who had a better foundation of support, watching them sail through their college years uninterrupted and with comparatively, not always, but often with comparatively fewer burdens. I remember feeling so cheated by all that. But one of the consequences of it was that I had made a lot of friends on the faculty. They would see me hitchhiking to school. you know, as they were driving into the parking lot and whatever, and some of them would pick me up from time to time and take a special interest in my circumstances and situation. So 25, 30 years later, there was a vacancy on the Board of Trustees. There had never been a graduate of the school, and the leaders of the faculty union and the academic senates at both the colleges approached me and asked me if I would run to be on their Board of Trustees. And of course I said no. It was a large district, about as big as a congressional district, and expensive to do something like that. And I explained that I just, you know, I didn't like raising money, and I had tried that before, and I never felt comfortable asking folks for money, and it didn't seem like a very good fit. So they told me that they did what I did years earlier, which is they just didn't accept that. And they organized a campaign on my behalf, and the faculty started raising money to get me on their Board of Trustees. And they opened up a bank account, and they organized teams of people to go knocking on doors, and they printed up the first brochures, and then they came back to me and they said, you know, this is no longer a question. This is, you're running. We've already started. And so I ran, and wouldn't you know it, it became a contested election, and one thing led to another, but I found myself elected to the Board of Trustees, and then shortly thereafter the members of the Board of Trustees elected me as their president, and I found myself the president of the Board of Trustees of one of California's largest community college districts, managing about $1 billion a year in public funds, and overseeing the educational destinies of tens of thousands of students. I guess people say this all the time, but I'm a walking example of it, only in America. I get to travel around the world. I have in my capacity as a journalist and now as a government official. I don't see these stories anyplace else. And maybe we will come to see more of them as the world becomes a smaller place. I hope so. But despite all of the travails and weaknesses of our system, our culture, and our politics, the United States still, because of patterns of openness, engagement, and in particularly because of the dedication of people who work in higher education systems where they've dedicated their lives to helping educate the next generation, you encounter people, at least I did encounter people, who helped me over all of the different barriers that I faced. I can tell you with absolute certainty that what I have accomplished to date, I did not do by myself. As a matter of fact, I look back on it sometimes and I think, what part of it did I do? Because there were so many others who were standing ready, from that newspaper editor to the faculty leaders that I encountered, to the other mentors and supporters that I had along the way, who are far more responsible for the fact that I'm standing in front of you today in this capacity than from my own individual efforts. So I tell you that story, again, just so that you'll know what a spectacularly bizarre thing it is that I get to stand in front of you or any other group in this country or around the world and speak on behalf of the President of the United States. It's extraordinary, and it's a testament to the capacities that each of you have to change and to transform lives, and to not only be leaders in your communities and in your academic cultures who transform your own institutions, but in addition, to play a role in transforming the lives of others in the most fundamental and extraordinarily important ways that will have meaning not only to them, but to their families, to their children, to everybody else who comes after them. So thank you, really, for the work that you do. And know that many of us who work in positions of policy in the Obama administration have similar backgrounds. We were sought out exactly for these kinds of reasons. This is what the president did shortly after he was elected, and his transition team was put in place for the Department of Education. They went looking for people like me. You could have knocked me over with a feather when the opportunity to serve in the Obama administration came. I had contributed, I think, $50 to the campaign. My wife and I, we're not wealthy. She's also a journalist. A better journalist than I am, I should add. She was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. She won the award from the California Publishers Association as the best investigative reporter in California. But still, we're not wealthy. We had made sandwiches for the local headquarters and brought them in on occasion and did what we could. And then to be given this opportunity to serve in a senior position in the Department of Education is the most extraordinary opportunity of my life. And now I sit just down the hall from Secretary of Education Arne Duncan, who I see on a regular basis. I visit the White House 2, 3, 4 times a week and have the opportunity to have a seat at the table where important issues related to open educational resources and higher education are discussed, and where I'm often brought in for advice on a wider range of issues. At present, I'm the Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of the Undersecretary of Education. We have responsibility for the federal government's entire oversight of higher education. That includes the student loan system, the Fulbright Scholar systems, the Pell Grants, anything that has to do or touches with higher education policy or programs comes through our office. Let me talk a little bit about President Obama's commitment to open educational resources, because it really started with him, and it has a direct bearing on your work. And then I have 3 or 4 other key points that I want to share with you today, really based on the most recent things that I've learned about where this field is going and where I think you could have the greatest impact in the months and years ahead, in addition to, of course, encouraging the work that you're already doing, which is so critically important. A few months after the president was elected, and indeed while the FBI and others were vetting my suitability to serve, from that moment I got the call to the moment they said, okay, you can come, was about 3 months. And it was a startling 3 months where about the largest thing that had ever happened to my wife and I had just happened, and we couldn't tell anybody. And so that was a trying time. But about that same time, President Obama announced his proposal for what he called the Online Skills Initiative. Some of you may remember that original proposal made, I think it was in March, right after he was inaugurated. And in that proposal, he made a bold and revolutionary suggestion that the federal government ought to support a new generation of post-secondary courses and learning materials that would be open source, that would be open and customizable and reusable and remixable. His original proposal came under the rubric of a legislative vehicle called the American Graduation Initiative. And the open education resources component was originally envisioned as a $50 million a year investment in the production of these open curricular materials per year over 10 years. So a total investment of $500 million over 10 years. And the president proposed to finance that, not by raising taxes, but instead by reforming the student loan system, which probably many of you know had for many, many years been quite a sweetheart deal for the banks, who were essentially subsidized in their offering of student loans, but protected against any defaults or financial losses that might occur from it. And our administration calculated that we could save taxpayers about $60 billion a year over 10 years by ending that subsidized arrangement with the banks to offer student loans and instead having them be offered directly by the federal government, which after all was guaranteeing the loans to begin with. And that was a tenacious fight in the US Capitol and consumed most of the first year of those of us who were there in the department at that time. Many people, you're forgiven if you're among them, most of my immediate family members didn't know this either, didn't realize that that provision was tucked in, the provision reforming the student lending industry, was tucked into the healthcare reform bill that got all of the attention. Everybody was talking and fighting about what was going on with the president's proposal relevant to healthcare, and I'm sure you all remember how tied up in knots Washington and indeed the rest of the country was during that episode. But it was actually called the Healthcare and Education Reform Reconciliation Act. And part of it, and part of the reason that that measure was fought so determinedly, was that in addition to creating the breakthroughs that it did and that it promises to in the years ahead in the healthcare field, it also contained this reform for the banks. But at the very end, literally at the last moment, the night that it was being passed, Congress stripped from it the provisions related to open educational resources. And the $50 million a year over 10 years, $500 million total, that had been proposed in that, through a sort of a, some would say an accounting measure, others would say a gimmick, was removed. And of course, you can imagine there was opposition to it from some of the traditional incumbents in that space who didn't cotton to the idea of open educational resources becoming publicly supported and becoming available for use that in ways that might compete with the desires of certain special interests. But at the same time, that night, literally again in the dead of night, another opportunity presented itself. And that was an older piece of legislation called the Trade Adjustment Assistance Act, which had been sporadically funded since the 1960s, was up for refunding. And the purposes of that act were to protect and retrain workers who had been dislocated by international trade, people who had lost their job because their factory closed down and moved away. And that legislation simply directed the Secretary of Labor to create programs that would serve the interests of those workers in helping them get assessments, new skills, so that they can become reemployable. And we realized that although the original proposal the President had made had been defeated, that were money placed into that legislation with some administrative creativity and modernization, we could use that vehicle to support meeting those dislocated workers' needs with open educational resources that would also have multiplier effects and be useful for other purposes, in addition to the ones that they were narrowly delineated for. The traditional model of the Trade Adjustment Assistance Act, which I'll call the TAA moving forward, was that the federal government would give a student a voucher, $3,000, $5,000, something like that, and the student would then take that voucher to some training provider who would hopefully give them some sort of training or something, and they would learn some skill that would allow them to re-enter the workforce. So $2 billion from the savings from the student loan program was placed into funding the TAA with only a vague a description of exactly how it was to be used. And the President and the White House decided at that time that the Department of Labor would work with the Department of Labor, which owns that program, would work in close partnership with the Department of Education to modernize the methods under which those funds would be appropriated, and make it kind of a joint project. And I was given the responsibility of helping to lead the Department of Education's efforts in that modernization. So instead of $50 million a year over 10 years, we had $500 million a year over 4 years, or a total of $2 billion. And very early on, we made the decision that all of the intellectual property that would be produced for these education and job training resources would be released as open educational resources. So we went from what became a $50 million promise to a $500 million delivery in this space. And just 2 weeks ago, we announced the winners of the first $500 million in grants for the production of open educational resources to support high-quality post-secondary education and job training. The requirement is that the complication under the statute and the law is that to begin with, all of these materials have to be suitable to help dislocated workers re-enter the workforce. But when we assessed dislocated workers, we found out, of course, that they had many of the same problems entering or succeeding in the workforce as other groups. Many of them need basic skills. They need more modern technological skills. They need language. They need skills that match up with what the workforce demands, and that the materials that could be produced for them, if you think of it kind of like a Venn diagram, you know, those diagrams where circles overlap one with the other. If you had one circle of what dislocated workers need, and then if you had another circle of what the rest of everybody else needs in terms of access to open, high-quality educational opportunities, where those two circles overlap is a remarkable sweet spot that allows federal investments in this area to be multiplied significantly, so that rather than serving on a one-off basis the needs of any one learner, each dollar invested could be potentially of use to every similarly situated learner around the world. So we're in the first year of that, and the grant solicitation announcements for the second year of funding in that area are being prepared now. When I go back to Washington, that's the first meeting I'll have, I guess tomorrow morning, on working to develop that, and we'll be looking for ways to see what we can learn from the first round of grants that just went out and expand on it and strengthen it. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that when you take it in its totality, $2 billion investment in certifiably high-quality open educational resources by our administration represents the single largest expansion in access to high-quality education and job training opportunities in the history of the world. You haven't read much about this. As a former journalist, I'm shocked by that every day. I talk with journalists all the time, and I guess it's the kind of thing that once students finally get access to these materials and they start seeing, you know, the little logo on the bottom that says, you know, produced in partnership by the Department of Labor and Education, people start smacking their heads and saying, my goodness, where did all this come from? But it hasn't been terribly well covered, and it's another reason that I wanted to bring the news to you personally. Because if the news of this advance and accomplishment is to be made known to the American people, it's likely going to be done not through the major news media organs that some of us have come to rely on and or despise, but instead it'll come through the word of mouth of professionals like yourselves and colleagues who will point people to it and help others understand its significance. If you want to read more about this announcement, the easiest way to do it, I didn't bring a multimedia presentation today, but just do a Google search at some point for my name, Hal Plotkin, and White House blog. And that will lead you right to the announcement that we made on the White House blog when the first round of the solicitations was available. And at the bottom of that blog post, you'll see a link to the solicitation itself that we'll be working off to create the new one. So I'll come back to what we're doing in the Obama administration in just a few minutes, but I had actually 3 other main points I wanted to cover before inviting a conversation or any questions that you might have. And Carl, I'll look for you to give me the hook, because I'm still on Indonesia time. People could probably tell I could talk about this stuff for a long time. Why open educational resources? And why is it important, and particularly for the field that you're involved in? And the best summary that I have of that, and it's ironic because I see this language now being used in another context, but I assure you it's the language I've been using for the last couple of years. But what percentage of people around the world do you think, would you estimate, have access to high quality post-secondary educational experiences? I'm guessing, just knowing what there's no right or wrong answer to this, because nobody's actually counted it. It's part of the problem in any real robust way. But I'm guessing if you really added up the total capacity of all of our institutions, the Rices, the Stanfords, the state university systems, the similar ones that exist around the world, that it may be no more than 5% of the world's population who realistically have access to high-quality post-secondary education opportunities. That means 95% of the world's population are effectively, in one way or another, if not legally, then practically, locked out of the post-secondary system for higher education. 95% of the world's population. And if you assume that talent is equally distributed around the world, then you come to understand that in structuring a higher education enterprise that leaves out or that blocks out 95% of the world's population, we have architected or allowed to be architected or allowed to be maintained on our watch a system that is not only desperately unfair to those potential students, but cheats humanity out of realizing its potential. If there is a cure to cancer will be available soon enough to help the people in this room or those we care about who are or will be afflicted by that disease, it's so much more likely to be discovered and developed by somebody in that 95% than in the 5%. If there's a great work of art or literature that will bring the world together in common purpose and help it overcome sectarian nationalistic boundaries and move us to a place of improved international cooperation and collaboration, it's so much more likely to be found in that 95%. So it's in our interests, all of us, to do everything that we can to use currently available technologies and inclinations, including those resident in faculty, to provide and to bring high-quality educational opportunities to those who are currently precluded from meaningful participation in post-secondary systems. This is also a key to economic revitalization of the world's economy. That 5% who are well served by the current structure, well, for the most part, they've already bought the stuff they need. You know, many of them already have 2 houses. They've got their cars. The crisis we have in the global economy today is a crisis of global demand. Global demand has collapsed. And one of the main reasons global demand has collapsed is because the 5% are loaded with debt and fairly satiated in terms of their material needs, while the 95% can't afford to buy anything. You don't buy anything if you're dirt poor and illiterate. And people who are dirt poor and illiterate can't power an economic resurgence. But if we could find ways to bring literacy and numeracy and improved educational and language facilities to that part of the world, people who are educated build more, they buy more, they trade more, they hire more people. And although it's not a quick fix, it's not the kind of thing where you turn a switch and all of a sudden you have 1 million more jobs, it's the only sustainable path to restoring global economic growth to rates that we were more familiar with in the post-World War II era that allow for the kinds of more comfortable lifestyles and expansion of educational opportunities and growing of the pie that is both our national and international economic salvation. So for us, for the leaders in the Obama administration, and certainly for the President himself, and for the leaders in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, with whom I work on an almost daily basis, this is not a feel-good education issue. This is a national security issue. This is about the future of democracy, the future of open markets and open societies. And that's really why I'm with you today, is to make sure that you understand the context in which the federal government has invested in your work and the seriousness of purpose with which we regard your efforts moving forward, and the degree to which we will continue to support those efforts in every way that we can, and to highlight them and to bring more resources to bear as we move forward together in meeting these important needs. Carl was kind enough to briefly mention free to learn. I won't, it was nice to see it listed, and I won't belabor much about it. I just want to make 2 quick points about it and then urge you to look at it. It's Creative Commons licensed, and it's available to all of you for free and for free distributions. Ironically, in the kind of weird billiard balls hitting each other in random ways, but then somehow a pattern emerges later that we call life. One of the opportunities I had as a journalist 10 or 12 years ago was when Larry Lessig was thinking about this wonderful idea that he had called Creative Commons. And I thought it was such a great idea, it hadn't been born yet, that I ended up writing what became the first article ever written about Creative Commons, one that was used to originally develop some of the initial support and financing for it. And so now, Larry was with me in Indonesia earlier this week, and we both remarked at the incredible path that has taken place over the last 12 years from it becoming an idea to it now being the intellectual property license that governs or that makes possible the use of open educational resources in now tens of millions of publications with thousands and thousands of scholars involved. This is just one piece, but there are two takeaways from Free to Learn that I would like you to think about and also to consider how you might be able to help with. One is that when I agreed to serve on the Board of Trustees at the Community College District, one of the reasons, besides being flattered by the invitation from the faculty, but one of the goals and one of the reasons for doing it was because I thought, well, you know, if I actually do get on that thing, there's something I'd like to do. And it grew out of some of the articles I had been writing for the San Francisco Chronicle back in those days, where I was writing a column on the intersection of technology and public policy. And I'd been asking myself, and actually asking our readers, why it was that when the internet existed and all of these other new realities of technology were possible, that when a poor student, as I was 25, 30 years earlier, showed up, for example, at Foothill College to learn mathematics, the first thing they did was send me to a bookstore to buy a $130 book. And it just seemed incongruous. Couldn't we spend $60 billion a year in the US on education? Couldn't we come up with a free, high-quality math, algebra, statistics textbook that interested faculty members could be paid to create and that could be given to students for free so that students could spend that money fixing their car or getting childcare, or doing whatever else they need to do and be able to attend classes and pay attention to their studies. And so I'd written a lot of these articles, and then when I found myself on the Board of Trustees, I thought, well, fate has given me this wonderful opportunity to see if we can do that. And we did. We created at the Foothill De Anza Community College District, and it's detailed, and the story is detailed in Free to Learn, the country's first policy, governance board policy on open educational resources. At the time we were calling it public domain learning materials. It's another talk about why we switched the name. But the policy was very simple, and it simply said that the chancellor of our community college district had the responsibility to support faculty members who wanted to create or to use or to improve open educational resources for the established curricular purposes of the district, and that the chancellor would report back to our Board of Trustees at least once a year on her progress. This had dawned on me as just an elemental, it ought to be an elemental defined purpose of every higher education institution in the country. But we were going to start with the one that I was president of the Board of Trustees of. It struck me as just bizarre, for example, that a faculty member could be walking across one of our campuses and could see a divot in the football field and could know exactly who to call to get that divot in the football field repaired. And more likely than not, the next time they were walking across the campus, the football field would be repaired. But if the same faculty member were walking across a campus and said, you know, I want to create a free, open piece of scholarship that I would like to use and share with my students, and also to collaborate with other faculty members who teach similar disciplines, that faculty member in most cases has no place to go. Where does that person turn for support? Why is it that all of you have to turn to the federal government and FIPSI and similar programs to do what is essentially the most important work of education, which is the development of high-quality curricular materials that can be offered to students on terms that they can afford and experience. And ought it not to be a governance purpose of higher education institutions to provide students with those materials, not to require faculty to produce them, not to take away the rights of faculty to publish in alternate domains, including copyrighted. I'm a writer, after all. I'm, made my living for close to 30 years as a writer and media producer. We weren't trying to take anybody's property away, but we were saying if there are faculty members who want to produce these materials, then the school ought to support them and find ways to make that possible. And we passed that policy. We only passed the policy, though, after first surveying the faculty, where, because one thing that our chancellor, who was very savvy and who I used to supervise as president of her board, she's now our undersecretary of education, and so she's now my boss. We switched places, much to my delight. And her thought was, we need to do this, but only do it in a way that the faculty supports. And so let's start by surveying the faculty. And we went to the leaders of the academic senate and we asked them, if we gave or offered faculty support for the production of open educational resources, would you welcome that? Would you use it? And overwhelming numbers of faculty members, not all of them, but certainly more than a critical mass, including superstars in every department, stepped forward and said, by all means. In fact, we discovered that many of them were already producing open educational resources for use by their students on their own, uncompensated, working nights and weekends, simply because they knew it was the way to help their students. After we passed our policy, for example, one math professor came to our Board of Trustees meeting and waited for the part of the meeting through a lot of long, tortured fiscal reports and all kinds of nonsense. Waited till the part of the meeting where he could address the Board of Trustees. And he said, I just want to thank you for passing this policy. He said, it's improved the situation in my class dramatically, because now I'm able to work on developing these materials and providing them to my students for free. They're high quality, and as a result, my students, it's improving what's going on in my classroom because my students trust me more. They know that I've fought hard to get them the best possible materials at the lowest possible cost, and it's built a kind of trust relationship that didn't exist before. And the students stay after class to talk with me, they email me, they call me up, they know I'm on their side. Thank you, Board of Trustees, for making it clear to my students that I am on their side and giving me the support to make that possible. So here we are now. That was 2003. Here we are now in 2011, so it's 7, 8 years later. And I would like to tell you that these official governance policies that we enacted so successfully in Foothill De Anza, and which helped bring us to the attention of President Obama shortly after he was elected, have been replicated in exactly 0 higher education institutions around the country. The gap between what is, in terms of governance, and what faculty and students desire, and what the governance boards and officials who run higher education institutions could be doing, is as big as the Grand Canyon, or even, as my 6-year-old daughter would say, bigger than Jupiter. It's extraordinary omission of opportunity that has led to what is a great opportunity for you and other early leaders of the open educational resources field. Because that then touches on the next point I wanted to raise with you, which is sustainability. The work you're doing is extraordinarily important, but the question I get asked most often is, how do we sustain this work? The grants are being cut. We can't keep going around. Open educational resources is a bit like a cargo cult. If there are any sociologists in the room, you remember the reference to cargo cults. Cargo cults were, I'll give it a bad definition. If there is a sociologist, somebody will correct me later, but was the idea that the anthropologists used to visit like South American jungles, to native societies there, and they would fly into these, quickly made airports, and then they would try and study the local culture. But when they came, they had all of these goodies with them, hammers, nails, packaged food, whatever. And they discovered a little while after making all of these landings that they had transformed the local cultures, because instead of enjoying their local cultural activities before they were invaded by the people who were studying them, now they would all just line up around the airfield and chant and dance and all the rest, waiting for the next cargo plane to land. And these were called cargo cults. And open educational resources is in danger of being a cargo cult, where unless some plane lands and gifts you with resources, there's no way to continue the essential work that you're doing. And so people say, well, you know what we really need is we need some organization that has as its purpose the provision for the general welfare, that's concerned, that has resources, that's concerned about education, that's involved in education, to support these activities moving forward. And I would put it to you that we already have that organization. It's called the government. It's called schools. And our task, your task, our task in partnership, is to help the governance officials at the institutions at which you reside and we reside recognize their responsibility and live up to it. The federal government cannot, for as long as our administration is there, we will continue to direct as many resources as we possibly can to supporting this kind of work. But ultimately, it will sink or swim. It will be sustainable or not be sustainable, depending on how well support for it is transferred into the mainstream governance and philanthropic activities of higher education institutions themselves and of the states that support higher education institutions. And when support for open educational resources materializes in real ways, like we did in our community college district, through governments and through systems of education and through schools, that's when the transformation that those materials can enable, when it's at the core of the higher education enterprises, that's when the transformation that it can enable will become much more profound and durable and in fact sustainable. Two other quick points, and then I'll conclude. One has to do with badges. Have any of you ever heard of badges? Oh, good. I'm glad that not everybody. But congratulations. And for those of you who haven't, I hadn't not long ago either. And I'll tell you another quick story. I apologize for going on so long, but you invited me. So I was in Barcelona a few months, it's about 8 months ago. And I was at I was at the Mozilla Drumbeat Festival. You probably know Mozilla is the foundation that supports the Firefox browser that a lot of us use. And they get, I don't know, they have some kind of deal with Google. They get $30 or $60 million a year from Google because when you do a search on the Mozilla Firefox browser, it automatically takes you to Google. And their purpose, their defined purpose, is to keep the internet free and open, to make sure that no one company, so they have an open source browser, and to make sure that no one company ever comes to dominate communications on the internet. And their companion purpose is that the internet be used as a powerful vehicle for the transmission of high quality education opportunities. So they have a focus on education. And they were sponsoring their annual Drumbeat Festival, and they were doing a partnership with the MacArthur Foundation. So they invited me to talk, and I gave my little talk. A pretty raucous group from all over the world of open source folks. And at the end of my talk, this young woman came up to me and she said, Mr. Plotkin, we really like you a lot. And I've been reading your stuff for years now, and a lot of us pass it around, and we just think you're great. And we really appreciate what you're trying to do to reform and improve and modernize the higher education system. But we don't think you're going to be successful. So we've just decided to replace it. Would you like to come and see what we're working on? And I said, sure. And they invited me into the Mozilla MacArthur Foundation Badges Working Group. I think it may have been the first time that they all physically assembled in one place. If not the first time, it was one of the first time. And so I found myself in this meeting with, I don't know, 40 or 45 of the most energetic, technologically inclined, I guess some would call them nerds, I would call them futurists, people from around the world. Piercings were far more common than formal wear in this group. And I was fascinated by what they were doing, and I ended up staying with them till nearly 4 o'clock in the morning. And they were working in a kind of an accordion business process where they had developed, they have support from these 2 foundations now, and there were representatives of both Mozilla Foundation and MacArthur Foundation there as well. Ann May Chung at the MacArthur Foundation is helping to lead this work, an extraordinary visionary. And the idea goes something like this. I'll give you one early model of how it works, but I think it has profound impact. It will have profound impact on your work going forward. So they fashioned, in the partnership with, I think it's the International Association of Web and Graphic Designers or something like that, a curricular, alternate industry recognized credential program is essentially what it is. That organized a curriculum online from OER that's all free that teaches someone how to become a graphic designer or a web developer. And it has all of the lessons in it that you would imagine. You know, how to build a web page, how to make a logo, all of the things that graphic had, a letterhead, all of the kinds of things that a graphic designer would want to do. And all of the instructional materials are free, and the student goes through the process until they get to the point where they want to have what they've done assessed, their portfolio of work that they've created in this process. And then they petition to the International Association for an assessment, and they pay, I don't remember what it is, $35, $85, something like that. I remember it was under 100. And senior members of that group look over the portfolio of work, and if they determine that the student has successfully accomplished the work in order to have mastered that curriculum that's been organized for them, they award them what they call a badge, a little digital badge. The badge has the logo of the International Association on it. And the student can take that badge and they can put that badge on their resume. And then when they're applying for a job somewhere, the employer can click on the badge and see the portfolio of work that the student did to enable them to achieve that industry recognized credential. And this is where the woman who was running this project said to me, think about this, Mr. Plotkin. Think about it 10 or 15 years from now. You're an employer, and you're interviewing 2 candidates for an open position. It's Friday afternoon. You need the person to start Monday morning in a mission-critical position. And in walks 2 job candidates. One of them has a nice, shiny diploma from an Ivy League institution. And the other one has a resume that's full of 10 or 12 of these badges in the exact operational areas that you need the employee to be proficient on when they start at 8 o'clock on Monday morning. And what's more, you can see exemplars of their work in each of the areas. Which of those 2 systems is going to win in the end? Then if you think about it, that if the system that accommodated that nice, shiny Ivy League diploma can only accommodate, say, 5% of the world's population, and the other system can accommodate everybody else, which is going to become the preferred system of credentials, educational credentials that are meaningful in the marketplace? And after all, isn't that one of the main, not only, but isn't that one of the main justifications of the entire higher education certificate and degree granting process, is to create some kind of reliable arbiters of quality that employers and others can rely on? And now I don't know. I'm not a futurist. I'm just a writer. But and I don't know if this is going to replace higher education as we know it, with all of the Ivy and all of the rest. But I do think that this is going to have an impact on higher education. And as we move forward in the years ahead, these kinds of new systems of creating industry-recognized credentials, both for learners and also for teachers, I think will become extremely important. Let me conclude then by giving you some sense of how fast all of this is moving, just because I got back from this international conference where I had dinner with the president of China's recently renamed Open University. Used to have a different, far more bureaucratic and communist-sounding name, and now it's the China Open University. He has 3 million students in degree granting programs at the present time. One of the things he said to me, incidentally, and I'll be happy to be the person who builds these bridges with you or anybody else, he says, do you happen to know any institutions or programs in the United States that might want to work with us, particularly in areas of language acquisition? 3 million students, eager, looking for partners with open educational resources as the bridge. Similar progress underway in India, where the Indira Gandhi Open University now has close to, if not more than, 1 million students. The United States, as fast as we're trying to move it in the Obama administration, has some serious catching up to do. And you are in the forefront. You are who we are counting on, leaning on, and depending on to continue to lead your institutions, your programs, and in fact your country as we try to step up to this enormous opportunity, which means so much not only to you and your programs and to our administration, but in fact to the entire global economy. So finally, let me conclude by reminding you what President Obama said on that night when he won his improbable victory in the presidential primaries, where it was clear he would become the nominee of the Democratic Party, and which led directly to the improbable fact that I stand in front of you here today. He reminded the people in the hall that night, in a phrase that's been oft repeated, that when it comes right down to it, we are the people we've been waiting for. And what I would say to all of you here this morning is that our work together has just begun. Thanks for your attention.
Hal had a lot to say, and he cut in a little bit into the Q&A time, but I do want to take at least one question, and then we'll have to take a break because we need to set up our Skype for our next speaker. But anybody have a question for Hal?
I think I probably covered everything. So.
Yeah. Hello?
Yes, sir.
I wonder if the Obama administration and the Secretary of Education have probably done more to devastate international studies than anyone else up to this time. And that has led to a lot of unemployment in this area. It has led to the scuttling of all kinds of programs and projects that the kind of you're talking about. For example, we have an online beginning Korean program that the development of which is just dead now. It just, I don't know, I mean, it seems to me that the emphasis on international studies, specifically language, it's hard to address because there's so little response to any of the issues that come up with that kind of a cut to what were really thin, lean programs to start with.
It's a very fair question and a very important observation. And I think if you could draw something from my presentation, it would be to help you understand, as an administration, how creative we had to be to get any support, any resources for open educational resources, absent explicit cooperation from the US Congress. And there's a difference between what we as an administration would have proposed, and would like to see happen, and what we can get moved through the US Congress. So I can assure you there's no lack of appetite on behalf of our Assistant Secretary for International Education, Maureen McLaughlin, or her companion, Andre Lewis, both of whom, if you look at their publications and the work that they've done for decades, comes from the leadership of these international education programs and the proposals and speeches that they've made since we've been in Washington. But we live in a tripartite system of government where it is difficult, to use the diplomatic word, to get certain forces in Congress to understand that support for international education does not come at the expense of domestic needs. And that's a...
Our understanding is about Title VI did not come through, were made in the administration, were made in the Department of Education. And money, say, that went to something like Race to the Top wasn't touched, whereas Title VI was. And that's the issue, I think, the questions that we have that we can never get answered.
Right. Well, I can get you more specific answers from our assistant secretaries of international education, and if, the best way to do it is if you send me an email with a very specific set of queries. I'll make sure that you get very specific, on-point answers to each of them, and that will illuminate the budgetary processes that are involved in making those kinds of decisions and recommendations. I think it's extraordinarily clear from the work that I know and the colleagues that I know that there is a much greater appetite to make requests, budgetary requests in this area, but that on occasion requests are made, official requests are transmitted to Congress based on what we know can pass within the deadlines and timelines that avoid things like the government shutdowns that were. So then you could come back later on and said, well, you were in favor of so and so because you made that proposal, but the proposal may have been generated at a time when it was the only way to avoid some even more dire consequence from occurring. I can't, on the balls of my feet right here, detail for you the exact budget mechanisms that were in play that led to the cuts that you and I both lament, which extend far beyond the programs you just mentioned. But there were some programs that the president proposed for which we could get congressional support, and there were others that we couldn't. And to blame us because we couldn't convince the Congress to do things they didn't want to do, I don't know would be entirely fair. The fairer thing would be, I think, to look at what we've proposed and what we continue to propose. And to determine what the obstacles are to implementing those proposals.
I'm going to have to stop. We need 10 minutes to set up for our next speaker, and this discussion is obviously going to go on. It's a terrific question.
And should go on.
And should go on, and needs to go on. So 10-minute coffee break, and we'll start at the top of the hour.
Thank you.